thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. I sincerely appreciate it. If you'd like to see your name in the credits and gain access to a plethora of other perks, bonuses, and extras, please consider becoming a patron today. Simply click the link in the description below. Thank you.
This is a worldview that holds the Holocaust was necessary and a good thing. You see, because those people were weak and needed to be exterminated for the progression of the Aryan race.
Goodness gracious me. This guy is a spectacular moron. This is absolutely unforgivable. Unforgivably stupid. I'm sorry, dear listener, some of you get upset when I throw out insults like this, but I'm just being honest here. This guy is incalculably moronic. This is just beyond belief.
If you ever try to bullshit me like that again, I will rip off your arms.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and you're all very welcome to another episode of The Most Annoying Religious People. Coming right up is a theist who believes that the atheist worldview, if you bring it to its logical conclusion, leads atheists to a world where they cannot be thankful for anything. He believes that atheists have no basis for morality, and worse still, he thinks that the atheist worldview makes you duty-bound to be grateful for things like the Holocaust. A rather extravagant claim, if you don't mind my saying so. So without further ado, we're going to dive right in. All I'll say, dear listener, is buckle up, because the stupidity is on full display. Hey everybody, apologies for the interruption. This editorial note has been inserted in post in order to make you aware of the following. A particular virus that shall remain nameless is mentioned numerous times by the theist in this video. Any and all mentions of this virus have been censored using the following bleep. So if and when you hear it, please don't be confused. I'm simply protecting my channel from the unwanted attention of the YouTube censors. Because, as you all know, any and all mentions of this dreaded virus result in demonetization, and worse still, channel deletion. So with that said, let's proceed with the video.
When medical science finds a cure for COVID-19, am I going to thank God? Yes, I am. Why? Because I, unlike most atheists, am intelligent and intellectually honest enough to follow the dictates, the doctrines, the teachings, and the practices of what I believe to their logical conclusion.
And we're off, folks, to a really bizarre start. Tell me this, dear listener. Do you agree with me when I say the following? Isn't it bizarre when Christians or theists more generally give thanks and praise to God when human beings accomplish great things? So when human ingenuity leads to the cure for a particular illness or a treatment to a particular condition or what have you, the theists of the world will very often respond by giving praise to God. Praise be to God! What an utterly bizarre thing to do. If you're correct, if your theology is spot on, God is the creator of all things, including the diseases that hurt and harm us, including the conditions and the maladies that plague humanity. Why would you thank God here? This really doesn't make sense at all. Now, to be fair, he is talking about the pandemic of recent memory, and there is some evidence bearing on the matter in terms of humanity's responsibility in causing that whole thing. You guys may or may not be familiar with the lab leak hypothesis. I'm not so sure what the epistemic status of that is. Maybe it's the case that humanity created the pandemic, maybe it isn't, but it's actually beside the point. You can't defend God by blaming human beings for causing a pandemic, because God controls all of the rules. God created us with a biology that allows us to be infected by diseases that we may in fact have produced ourselves. So even if humanity produced the pandemic, God is the one who's responsible for creating the biology that we have, a biology that entails the possibility of becoming infected with viruses, diseases, and maladies. Why would God do this? So when you thank God, forgive me for saying so, dear listener, and perhaps this is a crude reference, but it reminds me of the battered wife who says that she loves her husband despite the fact that he beats her up. Oh, well, deep down, I know he loves me. And you know what? After he beats me up, he always bandages me up and licks my wounds and takes care of me. Yeah, but he wouldn't have to do that if he didn't beat the shit out of you, my dear. There's a kind of a Stockholm syndrome at play here, where somebody falls in love with their captorer, where somebody falls in love with their torturer. I mean, this is a really sick psychology. Now, we could have a conversation about the problem of evil and whether or not God has good reasons for bringing evil into the world, and that's a full and thorough debate worth having. I'm just drawing attention to a very simple point here before we move on. It is perverse to give thanks and praise to he who is responsible for your suffering in the first place. So yes, even if you blame humanity, even if it turns out that the pandemic was caused by human irresponsibility, even if it turns out that the pandemic was caused by gain of function research and human beings made this happen, even if that's the case, the buck ultimately stops with God. God is still responsible in the fuller sense, because he's the one who gave us the biology that causes us to suffer with viruses and diseases in the first place. So yeah, it's really bloody bizarre to thank God for cures to maladies that he's ultimately responsible for, whether he caused the malady itself or whether he gave us the biology that includes the propensity to suffer from said maladies. So let me know in the comments below, dear listener, do you agree with my thoughts on this? Because it strikes me as utterly bizarre and strange. I view Christians on this question kind of like the battered wife, and I just wish they'd wake up and smell the roses. But what can you do? Let's move on.
Atheists don't follow what they believe, teach, and confess to its logical conclusion. They just don't. They can't. They're intellectually either incapable or dishonest, and they refuse. So what we have are two groups of people, both of them in the medical profession. Doctors, nurses, scientists, caregivers, Christians, and atheists. Both of them out there on the front lines, getting their hands dirty, facing death every day. So what drives the Christian and the atheist as medical professionals to both jump headlong into this thing and find a cure? Love and service to neighbor. That's what does it. You see, the Christian understands the greatest commandment. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul. And the second commandment being like it, you should love your neighbor as yourself. I don't know why the atheist is out there doing it. I have no idea. Christians are out there doing it because they practice what they preach, because they believe that to love God is they love God by loving and serving their neighbor. That's how they love and serve God and obey God, by serving their neighbor.
Did you catch that, dear listener? Did you notice the unspeakable evil that's on offer here? Please notice what he's saying. He is perplexed by atheistic generosity and goodwill.
I don't know why the atheist is out there doing it.
Why, you might ask? Because in his mind, there is no good reason to do charity. There is no good reason to go out into the world and to help your fellow man, other than if it comes in the form of a diktat from a divine author.
They love God by loving and serving their neighbor. That's how they love and serve God and obey God, by serving their neighbor.
And obey God by serving their neighbor.
If you were ever looking for evidence of the evil of religion, It's right here in front of you, dear listener. You know what? I hope this guy continues believing in God, because by the sounds of it, he wouldn't be a very good person if he didn't believe in God anymore. In his mind, there is absolutely no reason to do good other than if it is commanded by God. He is a divine command theorist. He thinks that the best reason to go out and do good in the world is because God commands him to do so. This is why he's perplexed by atheists who do good in the world. There's nobody commanding them to do so. So why would they do it? In other words, he's giving us an insight into his own psychology. He wouldn't go out and help people in the world. He wouldn't be a good person were it not for the commandments of God, were it not for God instructing him to love his neighbor as he loves himself. But that's the difference between Christians and atheists. Atheists do good for the sake of doing good. As the old Christmas song goes, we're good for goodness sake. We don't need divine permission. And what a mockery that makes of human goodness if it's only given as a response to a divine dictate. But leave it to a Christian to believe that the only reason to do good is if God commands you to do so. And so when this Christian is befuddled by atheists doing good, all he's revealing is the wickedness of Christianity. We can be good without divine permission. We can be good without the diktats of an all-knowing being who threatens us with eternal punishment or separation from God or annihilation. And if you think otherwise, you're just a moral scumbag. And it's that simple. Let's move on.
See, that's our worldview. That's the Christian worldview. The atheist worldview is that none of this is created. In spite of scientific doctrine to the contrary, matter was spontaneously created. Despite the fact that we know that matter cannot be created or destroyed. I should say, by itself, matter cannot be created or destroyed. That's why, in order for the creation of matter, it would require a God that wrote these laws of science into his creation. But the worldview of the atheist is that all that is in existence didn't exist, and for some odd reason known only to the flying spaghetti monster, it came into existence.
Did you catch it? Oh man, I swear, if this guy wasn't genuine, I would swear that he was a troll. I don't believe that this just happened. So, he says that matter cannot be created or destroyed.
We know that matter cannot be created or destroyed.
And then he realized, oh shit, that upturns my worldview. Oh crap, I've shot myself with the foot. So then he catches himself, and then he corrects himself, and he says, actually, what I meant was, no, it cannot be created or destroyed by itself, because obviously God has to create it, because God created everything.
I should say, by itself, matter cannot be created or destroyed. That's why, in order for the creation of matter, it would require a God.
This is absolutely perfect. So, yeah, sure. Matter cannot be created or destroyed. But if that's the case, then matter was always here. If it cannot be created or destroyed, you are tying yourself into an infinite past. And he realized that he was doing that, so he corrects himself.
2 hours later.
There's so much wrong with this little soliloquy of his. So first of all, he misdiagnoses the atheist worldview as one which encompasses the idea that matter, poof, came into existence out of nothing.
The atheist worldview is that none of this is created. In spite of scientific doctrine to the contrary, matter was spontaneously created.
The first thing I'll say on that is this. No, atheism doesn't require the belief that something came from nothing. It doesn't. Atheism is a single belief on a single issue. That's it. Atheists are not convinced that a god or gods exist. End of story. That's atheism, folks. Apart from that, atheists can have a whole host of beliefs and different ideas about origins. Some atheists might believe that the past is eternal, which would invalidate his claim about what atheists must believe. If you believe that the past is eternal, well then you don't have to believe that something came from nothing. Simple. right? Atheists can have all sorts of viewpoints. We don't need to go into it. The point is, he's wrong about what atheists must believe. That's the first thing. The second thing, and this is just so ridiculous, is that he tries to invalidate the alleged atheist worldview, something I've already debunked, but let's just go with it. Let's assume that to be an atheist, you must believe that something came from nothing. Fine, let's just accept that for the sake of argument. He then tries to invalidate that by citing the idea that energy cannot be created or destroyed. Matter cannot be created or destroyed.
We know that matter cannot be created or destroyed.
Fine. If that's the case, then sure, something can't come from nothing. But notice what happened next. The thing I've already had a big old laugh about. He realizes, oh crap, if matter cannot be created or destroyed, well then what I've just done is invalidate God's role in creation. So then he provides a big old exception for himself.
I should say, by itself, matter cannot be created or destroyed. That's why, in order for the creation of matter, it would require a God.
This is a fallacy, dear listener. We call it special pleading. Special pleading is the fallacy whereby you set up some rule that everybody must follow and then proceed by breaking that rule yourself. So you see the ridiculousness of what's happening here, dear listener? He wants to invalidate the atheist worldview, a view that he's already misdiagnosed, remember, but we're just going with it for the sake of discussion. But he wants to diagnose the atheist worldview as being ridiculous or nonsensical because they believe that something came from nothing, and yet science teaches us that matter cannot be either created or destroyed, which would rule out something coming from nothing. But that also rules out your theistic explanation of God creating everything out of nothing. If matter cannot be created or destroyed, well then it follows that God can't do it either. And he catches himself in this error and trips over himself and goes, what I mean is it cannot be created or destroyed by itself.
I should say, by itself, matter cannot be created or destroyed.
In other words, God can break this rule that I've set up and God can create matter. Special pleading, folks. The theist's specialty. Oh, don't you just love it? Don't you just absolutely love it? Coming full circle, it's absolutely ridiculous to suggest that atheists must believe that something came from nothing. That's not a requirement of atheism. It's also ridiculous to suggest that matter cannot be created or destroyed, and then in the very next breath say, but it was created by my God. A huge special pleading fallacy. And even if I allow for that exception, well then you'd have to allow me an exception as well. We can all invent exceptions to the rule. You don't get to break the rule and tell others that they're not allowed to do so. That's special pleading, and if you're allowed to engage in special pleading, so too am I. But you know what? I'd rather none of us engaged in special pleading. I'd rather you just stood by your initial claim that matter cannot be created or destroyed, and then say the truths. The obvious truth that's obvious to everybody watching this video. You don't know, and neither do I. Imagine that. Why is there something rather than nothing? I don't know. Do you know, dear theists? Of course, they'll never say that they don't know, because theists are in the business of knowing things that other people don't know. It's just a shame that in order to make those claims, they have to engage in fallacious reasoning. They have to engage in special pleading, and they have to misdiagnose their opponent's view by strawmanning it and suggesting that they believe things that they don't really believe. But anyway, let's move on.
Through death and through suffering and through the falling out of the weak, the strong survive. So the logical conclusion of the atheistic worldview is to fall to their knees and thank the flying spaghetti monster above that we have been reached out upon and touched by his noodly appendage, and that people are dying, that people are suffering. The atheist should be thanking let's just be honest, thanking the stars above that people are dying of virus. That is the atheistic evolutionary worldview.
This is an absolutely bizarre and ridiculous point. Correct me if I'm wrong here, dear listener, but this is, roughly speaking, what he has said. So first of all, he ties evolution to atheism.
That is the atheistic evolutionary worldview.
That's hogwash. There's nothing about atheism that necessitates that one believe in evolutionary theory. Nothing whatsoever at all. Atheism is a single belief on a single issue. Are there gods? Atheists say we're not convinced. End of story. You can be an atheist and believe in evolutionary theory. You can be an atheist and not believe in evolutionary theory. You can reject all of it. You could think Charles Darwin was a moron and be an atheist. It's utterly irrelevant. So this is the second time that he's attributed something to atheism that has nothing to do with atheism.
The atheist worldview is that none of this is created. In spite of scientific doctrine to the contrary, matter was spontaneously created.
I wish he would have a better idea about what atheism is before he made a video giving atheists shit about what they allegedly believe. I mean, just Google it, you idiot. What the hell? But anyway, let's just run with it. The leap that he makes next is just beyond belief. So he points out that part of evolution is this idea of survival of the fittest.
Through death and through suffering and through the falling out of the weak, the strong survive.
Although this is very often misunderstood. It's not necessarily survival of the fittest, it's just survival of the good enough. So creatures that can survive just well enough will pass their genes into the next generation, and that's the entire picture, right? In terms of survival of the fittest. He then takes this description of survival of the fittest and turns it into a normative ethical theory.
The atheist should be thanking let's just be honest, thanking the stars above that people are dying of virus.
What? For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, normativity is the domain wherein we make recommendations about behavior. If I tell you that you ought not steal, or that you ought not kill, or that you ought not do X, Y, or Z, I'm speaking normatively. But evolution isn't a normative, meta-ethical theory. Evolution, and the theory of evolution, is a description of how nature operates. It's a description of survival of the good enough, and digging into the weeds, it's a description of mutations and change over time. It has nothing to do with moral behavior or what we ought and ought not do. But he takes evolutionary theory, a description of how reality operates, and turns it into a normative ethical theory and says that atheists should be thankful for suffering because evolution entails suffering. This is just so muddled. Sure, evolutionary theory involves suffering. The theory describes how those that are not good enough will die, they will suffer in doing so, and so henceforth they will not pass their genes into the next generation. That's a description of nature and how it operates. It doesn't follow from this that therefore we ought cause suffering. It doesn't follow from that therefore we ought be joyous about the suffering of animals or what have you, or the suffering of humans and so forth. Do you see how muddled this is? Evolutionary theory is simply a description of the world and biology and how it functions. There's no normativity there. There's no recommendation about what we ought and ought not do about any of that. But he seems to have this ridiculous point of view which gives evolution normative force. And it just makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. And again, all of this grants the idea that evolution is part of the atheist worldview, which it isn't. But even if it was, evolutionary theory is simply a description of reality and how it operates. It tells us nothing about how we should act in the world.
This is a worldview that holds the Holocaust was necessary and a good thing. You see, because those people were weak and needed to be exterminated for the progression of the Aryan race.
Goodness gracious me. This guy is a spectacular moron. This is absolutely unforgivable. Unforgivably stupid. I'm sorry, dear listener, some of you get upset when I throw out insults like this, but I'm just being honest here. This guy is incalculably moronic. This is just beyond belief. So, if my previous point wasn't persuasive to you, if you didn't buy when I said that he's attributing normative force to evolutionary theory, if you didn't buy it then, you have no choice but to accept it now. He uses the example of the Holocaust and the millions of people who died. And he says that atheists should be thankful because the weak were being wiped out. And that's what evolution entails. Survival of the fittest and the wiping out of the weak.
That is the atheistic evolutionary worldview. This is a worldview that holds the Holocaust was necessary and a good thing. You see, because those people were weak and needed to be exterminated for the progression of the Aryan race.
You see what he's done there, dear listener? Again, he's attributing normative force to evolutionary theory. Evolutionary theory entails the idea not necessarily that the weak will fail to survive and pass their genes on. Rather, it's the idea that maladapted creatures will die and fail to pass their genes into the next generation. In fact, a creature could be spectacularly weak and yet have some other survival advantage that leads to the proliferation of that particular species. Suffice to say, it's the creatures who adapt satisfactorily enough to the environment that pass their genes onto the next generation. This is a description of how reality operates. It's not a prescription. The difference is crucial. Descriptive means this is how it is. Prescriptive means this is how it should be. Evolutionary theory is not prescriptive. It is not normative. There's nothing in evolution that says, therefore we ought wipe out X. It doesn't work that way. This guy just doesn't understand the most basic things. And he's here pontificating about atheism, misdiagnosing it, telling us what we believe even though we don't, misunderstanding evolution and telling people that evolution and evolutionary theory leads to genocide. It leads to holocausts. But there you go. Let's move on and see what this idiot is going to say next.
Let me be abundantly clear. I don't believe that the Holocaust was a good thing. It was morally evil. But see, that's my worldview that tells me that it was evil. The atheist is not honest with themselves in that their worldview tells them that has to have been a good thing.
Point of order, your worldview doesn't prohibit genocide. Your worldview doesn't prohibit anything. Divine command theory doesn't prohibit anything, for all God needs to do is change his mind, and then the opposite becomes moral. If God commanded you to carry out a genocide, dear theists, wouldn't you be duty-bound to do it? Wouldn't that become an intrinsically moral deed? Now, you might say, oh, but God would never command that. That's actually irrelevant. Whether or not you think God would or wouldn't is irrelevant. I'm talking about the meta-ethical foundation of your worldview, which entails the idea that whatever God commands becomes intrinsically moral by definition. So if God commanded you to carry out a genocide, if you're being honest, dear theist, you must admit that that would become a moral act. That's divine command theory, folks. But on the notion of the if, would God command a genocide? Well, if we're going to use the Bible as our basis for forming that conclusion, God conducts genocide in the Bible wholesale. God wipes out the earth's every living inhabitant by causing a flood. And I've had theists on my channel tell me in my comments that that was acceptable, that those people deserved it. Really? The babies too? There was no other option? God couldn't have re-educated them? No? And even if God couldn't, if there was no other option other than to wipe them out, the only method of dispatch that was available to your all-powerful deity was drowning? God couldn't have just snapped these fingers and caused those people to cease to exist in an instant. No, instead he has to drown every one of them, an excruciating death of suffocating as water fills your lungs. That's the God you believe in. Divine command theory is grotesque. It's absolutely grotesque. Now, am I saying I can do better? No, I don't think there's an objective basis for morality. I can't give you an objective basis for morality. But one thing I can tell you, one thing I can say that this theist can't, I would never countenance a genocide. I would never allow it, no matter what deity instructed it. I don't just listen to the divine diktats of an allegedly all-knowing, all-powerful being. That is absolutely ridiculous. But as per usual, dear listener, you can be the judge. Let's move on.
Where do they get their morals? Morals are contrary to evolution, because love and service to neighbor is contrary to survival of the fittest. It is counterproductive to the strong surviving and the weak dying. Love and service to neighbor, which is written on both the heart of the Christian and the atheist, is from God. And when we use it to serve our neighbor, we should thank God for it. Until next time, may God richly bless you in the grace and mercy won for you by Jesus' vicarious death on the cross for all of your sins.
And in closing, he misunderstands evolution once again. He says that morality is contrary to evolution.
Morals are contrary to evolution.
That love is contrary to evolution.
Or love and service to neighbor is contrary to survival of the fittest.
That couldn't be further from the truth. Don't you realize that we're a social species? Social species, by their very nature, require cooperation and reciprocal behavior. We have to get along. We have to be able to take care of one another in order to survive. Our species wouldn't have gotten this far if we didn't take care of one another, if we didn't look after the weak and the needy, if we didn't care for our children. When a baby is born, it's utterly helpless. And so it makes sense that evolution would instill a care ethic, a compassion ethic, an empathy ethic. These things are perfectly explicable under evolutionary models. In other words, we wouldn't have gotten this far if we didn't have these ethics. If we didn't care, if we weren't loving, if we weren't compassionate and empathetic, our babies wouldn't survive. We'd allow them to die in the cold. And so we wouldn't pass our genes into the next generation, and we wouldn't be here having this conversation. We'd have long since gone extinct. But because we're a social species, because we must get along in order to survive, because we have the desire to pass our genes into the next generation, consciously or unconsciously, evolution has programmed in our psychologies these capacities for empathy, love, kindness, compassion, etc. It's very easy to understand. But leave it to a Christian, a moronic theist like this one, to misunderstand evolution for the umpteenth time. Morality is not contrary to evolution. In fact, it's the opposite. Evolution is a prerequisite for morality and ethics. If we didn't have the evolutionary history that we have, we wouldn't have the feelings we currently exhibit. We're a social species, folks. In order to survive, we must get along, we must love, we must care, we must be empathetic and compassionate, and so on. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here having this conversation. And I'm going to leave it there, dear listener. Did you like this video? If you did, drop a like on it. That helps out the channel enormously, and it costs you nothing. If you enjoyed the video, there are many more like this one. So while you're at it and pushing the like button, why don't you hit the subscribe button as well? And when you do, make sure you check the bell notification icon. That way you'll be kept up to date with all of my uploads, and you'll even receive a notification as and when my latest videos go live. If you'd like to take your support for the channel to the next level, jump into the description box below. When you're there, you'll find the link to my Patreon. Click that link and you'll be brought to a page where you can sign up for as little as £3 per month. And for that, and depending on which tier you choose, you will gain access to a plethora of perks, bonuses, and extras. The last thing I want to ask you to do is to jump into the comments below and let me know your thoughts. Do you agree with my criticisms? Or better still, do you disagree? In which case, I really want you to tell me, because I often prioritize the comments that disagree with me. I'm all about that debate. I'm all about that conversation, and I hope you'll join me in the comment section below. All that said and out of the way, thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. All the best. Bye-bye.